too. I know you guys didn't come to see me talk, so I'll just let Rebecca get started.
Cool, thanks. Can the people in the back hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. No mic hidden. So thanks for that intro. I'm going to talk about 3 ways to use JavaScript with Rails. I'll talk a little bit about why I think it's sort of an interesting topic. We already went through this. So I'm the managing director at Thoughtbots Chicago. Thoughtbots, a web and mobile consultancy. We also do a lot of open source work, so Factory Girl, Paperclip, Shoulda Matchers, the Bourbon SaaS framework, all things that come out of Thoughtbot, and we just opened our Chicago office. So definitely check it out, and I'm happy to grab coffee with people and so I've been developing software professionally for over a decade. I've seen a lot of changes in JavaScript and how we work with JavaScript in that time. And I founded Write-Speak Code, which is an organization for women software developers. I organized the Gotham Ruby conference when I lived in New York. I moved back to Chicago in October. And I also was one of the first teachers at Dev Camp New York City. So I feel like this talk is for a lot of people, but primarily people who have used Ruby or Rails, have used JavaScript. Maybe you've connected them, maybe you haven't, maybe you've tried some JavaScript frameworks. I think as developers, we're often sort of learning on the job and just diving into things. And one of the things that I wanted to sort of look at was stepping back and thinking about the fundamental ways that like the client and the server communicate. I think it can be helpful especially when you're learning a new JavaScript framework, when you're trying to choose which JavaScript framework to use, and also when you're debugging, sort of understanding what weird errors you get to. So a quick overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about HTTP and AJAX and some of that basic stuff, and then we'll go through the 3 main ways, as I see it, that you can communicate using JavaScript and Rails. So bootstrapping your JavaScript, using HTML fragments, and using JSON. So mostly when I'm talking about JavaScript, I'm talking about JavaScript in the browser. Obviously there's Node and other things like that, but I'm really thinking about the client itself, and JavaScript's really the main thing where we can do fun stuff. It's a programming language, so we can do any computations. We can do DOM manipulation, we can add and remove HTML elements, and then we have things like jQuery, which just make our lives easier, particularly around this. But I'm sure a lot of you have heard of all the fun new JavaScript things that are coming out, React, Angular, Ember. There's like D3 to do JavaScript visualizations. All of this stuff is sort of popping up. But underneath the hood, all of this are sort of using these 3 different techniques. Okay, so back to basics. How does the web work? So we have a client, our browser, and we have a server. Basically, our browser says, I want some stuff, and the server says, here it is, or I don't have it, or I have no idea what you're talking about. And that conversation is HTTP. So the client asking for something is the request, and getting it back is the response. Hopefully this isn't too basic. I sometimes find it useful to go back to the basics. So a client always is the one who makes the HTTP request. Your browser always asks for it, and the server sends the response. There's different HTTP actions that we can take. We can ask for data, or we can ask the server to manipulate data. Which basically means our browser speaks an HTTP request. That's what it makes, and it understands HTTP responses. And for the server, it's the opposite. It speaks in HTTP responses, and it understands requests. I think the main thing that you need to know about HTTP is that everything is a string. So all of that communication is just a string, and it's all human readable, which is why we have things like HTTPS to sort of secure those strings. It's also always a pull. So the client always asks for stuff. The server can't push it. Well, there are ways, but not using HTTP. The server never says, hey client, you need this thing. We always have to ask. It's stateless, so if we make multiple requests, it doesn't know who we are or what happened before. So we always have to sort of like let it know what the state of our page is and what's going on. And then HTTP verbs, which I'm sure you know, post, get, put, patch, delete. Fundamentally, we'll mostly be talking about get and post / put / patch. And this is really like this is how the web works. This is how your browser communicates with the server. Period. There's very few other things that have happened that change that. A few things in WebSockets. This is how it's been going on since the beginning of the internet, which presents some challenges for us, right? Because things have changed a lot since the days of like AOL or when they were using the internet for military communication. So one thing that we've sort of innovated on is AJAX. AJAX is really just like a combination of a bunch of different things. And it's really just the way that JavaScript can make an HTTP request without holding up the browser. Because HTTP itself is synchronous, right? You make a request, and you have to wait, and you can't do anything else, and then you get it back. So AJAX allows us to present it to the user as asynchronous. It lets it happen behind the scenes. The user can still interact with our site, all of that fun stuff. It stands for asynchronous JavaScript in XML, and that's because XML used to be the string format that was sent back and forth, since our HTTP requests and responses are always strings. Usually we use JSON now, so it makes it a little confusing, I think. There's a JavaScript object called XML HTTP request. So if you've ever been in your Rails and you're looking up, how do I know if this request came from Rails or not, AJAX or not, you might see request.xhr ? And you might hear about XHR. That's what this stands for. Is the thing that initiated this an XML HTTP request object? And really, jQueries like $.ajax, $.get, or post just wraps around this. I could show you the pure JavaScript to do this, but it's ugly and you would never do it. So we're not going to do that. So in general, the way that we send data to the server are really two ways. One is in the URL, right? So if you're the standard Rails RESTful way to show something would be /user/1. So that one is an ID, and we're basically passing data in our URL. The other thing is that when we do a post, we sort of pass it not in the URL itself, but in the data that gets sent over HTTP. So this is forums and things like that. And usually, when we're doing this, we're talking about JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, and it's just really JavaScript objects, so similar to Ruby objects. Don't overthink it. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. And then how do we get data back from the server? So this is really what I want to focus on, because I think this is where a lot of confusion comes out, especially when architecting applications and trying to figure out what your AJAX request should do and when they should do different things. So fundamentally, this is sort of the three ways. And like I said, bootstrapping JavaScript, HTML fragments, and JSON. And remember, HTML is just strings. So it's all about sort of manipulating that string that gets sent back and forth. Bootstrapping JavaScript, some of this is really obvious. When you render the HTML, you put stuff in there that JavaScript can use. Sometimes it's just in HTML, like hidden fields in a form, or data attributes, and you can access it using .data with jQuery. But I think the thing that people often forget about is script tags are in HTML, which means when you're rendering your Rails templates in ERB, you can write a script tag, and then you can take any Ruby object and convert it to JSON. So Ruby's and Rails pretty sweet, and they give us this _JSON method for all active record objects. Caches have it. And so we can actually do var tweets equals our tweets to JSON. This is nice in certain cases. So means there's actually no AJAX request that happens, which can be positive. There's no extra HTTP request that the user has to wait for to get data. The only place that you're changing really anything on the server is in your HTML template. On the downside, like, we really have no access to the data. We can't do anything with it. The places where I think this is really useful is if you're doing things like data visualization and mapping, when you need to have like a big collection of data and you want your JavaScript to be able to use it immediately. And you're not then going to do more stuff with it. You're not going to manipulate it. You're really just, it's all about displaying. If you have like small pieces of things, this can also be useful. Like you need to know the user's name so you can display it on every page, or you have some modal, things like that. Small pieces of information can be really useful to do things this way. And in combination with some of the other techniques we're talking about, it can also be really useful. It's also the one that I think gets the least amount of attention. And sometimes people sort of struggle with that process, because when you don't use this, it often means the user kind of sees a blank page and then is waiting for stuff to happen. So HTML fragments, what I'm talking about here is really, we're going back to the AJAX request. And we're talking about like, what is the AJAX request to return? So what am I getting back from JavaScript? So you can, because it's just a string, you can return a string of HTML. I don't know how many of you remember this, but Twitter's trajectory has been really interesting. They started with Rails. They had a huge amount of scaling issues. They made a lot of different changes. And at first, they made a change using a lot of JavaScript. You've all seen their infinite scroll, where as you scroll down, it makes an AJAX request to get the next 10 things. And at first, they did it using JSON. So they got a JavaScript object, and they had to like turn that into HTML and show it. So when you first went to the page, you sat there while the Twitter site made a request, looped through all the like 10, 15, 20 tweets they were going to show you, generated the HTML, and inserted it into the top. They changed that to actually return just the HTML. So they returned HTML, and then using jQuery's append, we can just like shove that string in there. This is actually more efficient than inserting HTML elements one at a time, like constructing a string that has 10 elements in it and then appending it once is more efficient than doing them individually. DOM manipulation, accessing elements on the page is actually one of the most expensive things that we do in JavaScript. Most of the time, it doesn't really matter, but when you're Twitter, it matters, right? The nice thing about this is that it means we can reuse our ERB and HTML templates that we already have in Rails, right? We can sort of render the page, we can have that tweet partial, and then we can just use that again and return that in a different controller action for an AJAX request. Again, we have minimal DOM manipulation, which is generally more efficient. We don't have any access to the actual data itself. I think HTML fragments are really useful when you don't really need to do any computation with the data in JavaScript. It's fast. It tends to like have really nice performance. It keeps a lot of your code dry. And so those are the moments when it's useful. The other thing that your AJAX request can return is JSON. So JSON is JavaScript object notation. As I mentioned, the toJSON method is in a lot of Ruby objects, but definitely active record and arrays and things like that. When you're creating it, it basically looks like a hash, but you access it using dot notation. So I would say like person.name. So on the server, what this usually looks like is you say render JSON. So you change your controller to specifically say that it's rendering JSON and not HTML. And then you call toJSON on the object. In JavaScript, it means you now have an object that you can actually loop through, access various attributes of, store it, do whatever you want with it. There is a gotcha though. which is that HTML is strings. So the response actually comes back as like a string, curly braces, and like escaped quotes and stuff. But there's a couple ways for us to like get around that and have it like magically converted into a JSON object. There's a couple niceties that jQuery gives us using the get method or the AJAX method. There's a JavaScript JSON.parse method, which will take a string of JSON and convert it into an actual object. In our controller actions in Rails, we can say content type JSON, which will then do that conversion. If we're using the like, I don't remember what it's called, like the .js PRP files, using like the built-in Rails remote stuff. Yeah, got it. Cool. So JSON is really nice if you want full access to data on the client. So if you want to have sort of pagination, but if people go back, you keep a list of those objects so you can re-render them. If for whatever reason you want to have like a user object so you can access various information about the user without having to go back to the server. It can be more efficient in the sense that you're not making multiple requests every time you need something. It does require DOM manipulation to show it, right? Like we need to move through the collection of tweets. We need to then like construct a string of HTML or use like document create object to create all the divs and all of that fun stuff. It also requires both changes to client and server code, right? Like so we had to say render JSON instead of just rendering HTML like we normally would. And then we also have to do things a little bit differently in our client code, which we always knew we had to do. So JSON, I think, is super useful when you need the data for multiple things. Maybe you're displaying it, but you're also like updating a count. Any of those sorts of things are useful where there's multiple computations on the same pieces of data. You need to access the data after the request is finished. So you have some interaction on the page and you want to go back and get to it. And then when you want to store data on the client. So going back to what we were thinking about, like React and Angular and Ember, they're all doing this in various ways. Like, and if any of you have used Backbone, which is a little more minimal and you make a lot of decisions around that, most of them actually pull JSON from the server, right? And then do the manipulation and things like that in JavaScript. But they're also storing a lot of stuff in JavaScript. This can also be used in combination, right? Like you can create a JSON object that includes, like at the top level, an HTML key with the HTML string that's been rendered, as well as the data itself or specific data that you need about that object. I highly recommend that you peek into Twitter's actually infinite scrolling in Chrome. You turn on your network tab, you can kind of go through it and you can see what those objects look like and what they're returning. It has changed over time. I guess I've gotten to see that, but that can be like a useful way to sort of think about how to structure your information. So, there's sort of really fundamentally three ways to communicate and move data between your client and server. You can bootstrap it, you can basically put the data from your server on the page in a way that JavaScript can access it. You can return JSON via AJAX and then use those JavaScript objects, keep them around. Or you can return HTML fragments that you just sort of append into the DOM and make things. And just automatically render